My name is Zane Miller. I'm 36 years old, and on the night my parents threw my clothes onto the driveway of a house I helped pay for, I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out a small brass key, and set it on the hallway table without saying a word. That key opened the safe in the basement of that house. The safe where my father kept the deed to a property he didn't actually own. But I'm getting ahead of myself. 6 hours earlier, I was sitting in a glass conference room on the 14th floor of Apex Horizon Group's headquarters in Charleston, South Carolina, listening to a man I had respected for 11 years tell me I was a thief. We found the discrepancies in the glass mirage file, Zane, Pierce Vance said, sliding a manila folder across the table like he was handing me a verdict instead of a conversation. Cost overruns totaling $340,000. Structural revisions you never logged. The board wants this handled quietly. I opened the folder. The numbers were real. The signatures on the change orders were not mine, but they were close enough that a jury wouldn't blink. I designed every square foot of that resort, I said. 2 years, Pierce. 14-hour days. You were at my engagement dinner when I cancelled it because the concrete pour got delayed. The board doesn't see engagement dinners, he said. They see numbers. I want to tell you I fought back. I want to tell you I threatened a lawsuit, that I demanded a forensic audit on the spot. I didn't. I closed the folder, stood up, and said 4 words. You'll regret this, Pierce. He laughed. Actually laughed, the kind of laugh a man gives when he thinks he's already won. Regret what? Firing an architect who can't keep his paperwork straight. I picked up my laptop bag and walked out past 23 employees who wouldn't meet my eyes, because word travels fast in a building where everyone knows their next paycheck depends on staying invisible. What Pierce didn't know, what nobody at Apex Horizon knew, was that 8 months earlier, a law firm in Wilmington had sent me a letter I hadn't opened. I'd been too buried in blueprints to deal with my late grandmother's estate. That letter was still sitting in a drawer in my apartment, unread, from Whitfield and Cross attorneys at law. I didn't know yet that it would change everything. I drove 3 hours north to Oak Ridge, the town I grew up in, because some instinct told me my family needed to hear this from me before Pierce's version reached them first. I should have trusted that instinct less. My mother, Helena, opened the door in her robe, arms crossed before I'd even said hello. My sister Kira was on the couch behind her, phone in hand, her fiancé Damon beside her with his arm draped over her shoulders like he owned the room. Kira already told us, my mother said. Fired. For fraud. It's not fraud, Mom. Someone forged. Do you know what this means for the wedding? Kira cut in, standing now, her voice climbing an octave. The venue deposit is due Friday. $50,000, Zane. 50,000. Were you even planning on helping with that? I looked at my father, Arthur, who hadn't said a word since I walked in. He was standing near the fireplace, arms folded, jaw tight. 22 years I'd watched that man run a small architecture consultancy into the ground before Pierce Vance had, generously, absorbed it into Apex Horizon 11 years ago. I'd never once heard my father thank the man who'd swallowed his company whole. Dad. Say something. What do you want me to say, Zane? His voice was flat, tired, like he was reciting lines he'd rehearsed. You've always landed on your feet. Scholarship to Clemson. Job at Apex before you were 30. Kira's never had that. Kira needs this. So I get fired for a crime I didn't commit, and the response is that Kira needs a house. My mother's next sentence is one I will never forget, because of how easily it came out of her mouth, like she'd practiced it in the mirror. Kira and Damon need this house more than you do. You always land somewhere, Zane. You always figure it out. I looked at the box already packed by the door. My winter coat. My old yearbooks. A framed photo of my grandmother, Evelyn, the only person in that family who had ever looked at me like I mattered for reasons that had nothing to do with money. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I walked to the hallway table, took the brass key out of my coat pocket, the spare key to the basement safe that my father didn't know I still had, the one I'd kept since I was 19, and helped him install that safe myself, and I set it down. "This won't do you any good anymore," I said. My mother frowned. "What is that supposed to mean?" I didn't answer. I picked up the box, walked out the front door, and drove east, toward the coast, toward a property I'd inherited 3 weeks earlier, and hadn't told a single person about. Ravens Cliff Beach House sits on 4 acres of private coastline 40 minutes south of Wilmington, North Carolina. Black glass, cedar beams, a wraparound deck that faces open water. I'd found the address in a certified letter from Whitfield and Cross that I finally opened at 11:47 p.m. that night, sitting in my car in the beach house's empty driveway, engine still running, headlights cutting across a front door I'd never seen in person. The letter told me 2 things. The first, my grandmother Evelyn Miller had died 14 months ago and left me, not my father, not Kira, full ownership of Ravens Cliff, a property she'd purchased in 1994 under a holding company called Titleline Assets LLC. The second thing was the one that made my hands go cold on the steering wheel. Attached to the letter was a photocopy of a stock certificate. 60% ownership of Apex Horizon Group, transferred to my name in a codicil my grandmother had filed 4 months before her death, a codicil that, according to the attorney's note, had never been formally executed because the original notarized will filed with the county clerk's office listed a different distribution entirely. Someone had filed a second will. A will that gave everything to my father, and through him, gave Pierce Vance's family trust controlling interest in Apex Horizon. Someone had buried the real one. I sat in that driveway for 11 minutes before I called Whitfield and Cross's after-hours line. A tired paralegal named Renata picked up, and when I explained who I was, she went quiet for a long moment before saying something that made the whole night rearrange itself in my head. "Mr. Miller, we've been trying to reach you for 3 weeks. There's someone else who's been asking about that codicil. He called twice this month." "Who?" "A Mr. Pierce Vance." I looked up at the black glass house in front of me, a house that legally belonged to me, sitting on land my grandmother had protected for over a decade, a house nobody in my family even knew existed, and for the first time since Pierce slid that manila folder across the table, I felt something other than shock. I felt calm. Because if Pierce Vance already knew about the codicil, that meant the forged change orders in my termination file weren't a coincidence. That meant my firing hadn't been about $340,000 in cost overruns. It had been about making sure I never found out what was sitting in a beach house I didn't know I owned. I got out of the car, walked up the front steps, and used the key Renata had couriered to my apartment 2 days earlier, a key I hadn't thought twice about until this exact moment. Inside, past the foyer, in a locked study on the 2nd floor, I found a fireproof file cabinet with my grandmother's handwriting taped to the front drawer, "For Zane, when he's ready." I wasn't ready. But I opened it anyway. And what I found in that drawer would tell me exactly why my parents threw me out that night, exactly why Pierce Vance wanted me gone from Apex Horizon before the Glass Mirage project broke ground, and exactly who had been signing my name on documents I'd never seen. The file cabinet held 4 folders, and I read them in an order I didn't choose. I just grabbed the one closest to my hand, which happened to be labeled Titleline Assets, Formation Documents. Inside was a business filing from the state of North Carolina, dated March 1994. Titleline Assets LLC, registered by Evelyn R. Miller, sole managing member. Attached to it was a handwritten ledger, my grandmother's cursive, tracking a property tax payment made every January for 30 years. Ravens Cliff had never been rented, never been listed, never touched by anyone outside a 2-person maintenance crew paid out of a trust account I didn't know existed until that moment, First Coastal Trust, opened at a bank branch in Wilmington in 1996. The second folder was thinner. 3 pages. A codicil to my grandmother's will, dated February 14th of last year, 4 months before she died. I recognized the notary's stamp, Diane Okafor, Wilmington, license number printed at the bottom. The codicil named me as sole beneficiary of Titleline Assets, and assigned 60% of Evelyn Miller's shares in Apex Horizon Group to my name, effective immediately upon her death. 60%. Not a minority stake. Controlling interest. I sat with that number for a long time before I opened the third folder. The third folder was the one that made my stomach drop, because it wasn't my grandmother's handwriting at all. It was a copy of a will filed with the New Hanover County Clerk's Office 11 days after her death. A will that superseded the codicil, distributing the Apex Horizon shares to my father, Arthur Miller, in full. The notary stamp on this version belonged to someone named Russell Combs. I didn't know that name yet. I would, by the end of the week, wish I never had. The fourth folder had a single sticky note on the front in my grandmother's handwriting: "If someone else got here first, call Renata. Don't call your father." I called Renata at 7 a.m. She sounded like she hadn't slept either. "Mr. Miller, I need to be careful how I say this, because I haven't confirmed everything yet. But the notary listed on the second will, Russell Combs, his license was suspended by the State Bar in October of last year for filing fraudulent notarizations on 2 unrelated property transfers in Brunswick County." Suspended when? October 14th. The second will is dated October 22nd, Renata said. 8 days after his license was pulled. I stood on that back deck overlooking the Atlantic, phone pressed to my ear, and felt the whole shape of the last 11 years reorganize itself into something uglier than I'd let myself imagine. My grandmother hadn't just left me a beach house. She'd left me a trail. "There's something else," Renata said. The address listed for Russell Combs' notary office. It's a suite in the Apex Horizon corporate building. 4th floor. Pierce Vance's floor. I didn't sleep that day. Instead, I drove into Wilmington and sat across from Renata Ashford in a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, and for the first time, I asked the question I should have asked the night before. How long has my family known about the codicil? Renata pulled up an email chain on her laptop and turned the screen toward me. The chain was between her supervising partner, Harold Cross, and an email address I didn't recognize, Miller 1968 at Fastmail, until I realized the H stood for Helena. The first email was dated 6 weeks before my grandmother's death. My mother, asking Harold Cross directly whether Evelyn had made any changes to her estate plan recently. Harold's reply, careful and lawyerly, said he couldn't disclose ongoing client matters. The second email, dated the day after the funeral, was from my father. Arthur asked a more specific question: whether the firm handled the notarization of any codicils involving Apex Horizon shares, and whether those documents were legally binding if the primary will superseded them. He knew. Before the second will was even filed, my father was already asking how to make a codicil disappear. "There's one more thing," Renata said, and I could hear the reluctance in her voice, like she was handing me something she wished she didn't have to. "Harold met with your father in person 3 days before the second will was filed. Same week your father sold his stake in an old consultancy to Apex Horizon Group. Except the sale records I pulled show he didn't sell it. Pierce Vance's family trust acquired it through what's called a forced buyout clause, activated because your father defaulted on a $180,000 loan he took out against the business in 2019. I did the math out loud, slowly. So my father owed Pierce Vance money. And 11 days after my grandmother died, a fraudulent will surfaces that hands Pierce 60% voting influence over Apex Horizon through my father, a man who already owed him everything. That's what the documents suggest, Renata said. I can't say it in a courtroom yet. But that's what they suggest. I drove back to Ravens Cliff with the folders in a locked case on my passenger seat, and for the first time since Pierce Vance slid that manila folder across the conference table, I understood the shape of what had actually happened to me. I hadn't been fired for cost overruns on the Glass Mirage Resort. I'd been fired because 2 weeks earlier, Pierce Vance's internal counsel had flagged that a codicil naming me as majority shareholder existed in a probate filing system, and someone panicked. Someone needed me gone from the building before I connected the dots between a beach house I didn't know I owned and a company I didn't know I controlled. The forged change orders weren't really about money. They were about creating a paper trail that would discredit me before I ever found out what my grandmother had actually left behind. That night, sitting alone in a house with black glass walls and a view of a coastline my grandmother had quietly protected for 3 decades, I opened my laptop and did something I hadn't done in 11 years at Apex Horizon. I stopped being an employee, and I started acting like an owner. I pulled every public filing on Apex Horizon Group I could access, SEC disclosures, county property records, the incorporation documents for 3 shell entities linked to Pierce Vance's family trust. I cross-referenced them against dates, my grandmother's death, the second will's filing, my father's loan default, my own termination. Around 2 a.m., I found something that made me sit back in my chair. 8 months before I was fired, Apex Horizon had quietly opened a new investment fund called Coastal Renewal Partners, structured to raise outside capital for the Glass Mirage Resort. According to the fund's private placement memorandum, which Renata had pulled from a court filing related to an unrelated lawsuit, the fund's primary limited partner, holding 40% of the capital, was a firm called Hartwell Bridge Capital. I knew Hartwell Bridge Capital. I'd founded it 4 years earlier under my mother's maiden name, Whitmore, as a private vehicle to invest my own savings in real estate outside of Apex Horizon, a side project so quiet that even my accountant only knew it by its registered agent's name. Pierce Vance had raised 40% of the funding for his signature resort project from a firm he didn't know I owned. If I pulled that funding, the Glass Mirage Resort would collapse before it broke ground. I closed the laptop and walked out onto the deck. The tide was coming in, dark water folding over itself in the moonlight, and somewhere 3 hours inland, my family was asleep in a house I'd just handed the only key that mattered to. They thought they'd thrown out a fired architect. They had no idea they'd just locked the door on the one person who could take everything they were protecting. The next morning, my phone rang at 6:15 a.m. It was Kira. "Zane, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me," she said, her voice tighter than I'd heard it in years. "Did Grandma Evelyn ever tell you anything about a house? A property near the coast?" I looked out at the water, at the black glass reflecting the sunrise, and felt the first real pull of the trap closing. "Why do you ask?" "Because Mom just got a call from a lawyer," Kira said. "And she's been crying in the kitchen for 20 minutes. I let Kira's question sit in the silence for 3 full seconds before I answered it. "I don't know anything about a house," I said, which was technically true, and also the last honest lie I'd ever tell my sister. "Mom's freaking out, Zane. The lawyer said something about a codicil. About Grandma's estate being reopened." Kira's voice had lost its usual edge, the one that had asked me about wedding money 2 nights earlier. Now she just sounded scared. "Do you know what a codicil is?" "It's an amendment to a will." "An amendment to what, exactly?" I didn't answer that one. Instead, I asked her a question of my own. "Kira, who's the lawyer that called?" "Someone named Harold Cross. Whitfield and something." Harold Cross was Renata's supervising partner. If he was calling my mother directly, that meant something had moved without me, a filing deadline, a court notice, a formal reopening of probate that I hadn't authorized. I hung up with Kira and called Renata before 7 a.m. "I need to tell you something before you hear it somewhere else," Renata said, and the formality in her voice told me she'd rehearsed this. "Harold filed a formal challenge to the second will yesterday afternoon. Standard procedure once we confirmed Russell Combs' notary license was suspended at the time of signing. The county has to notify all named parties in the original will. That includes your parents. You filed without telling me. You're the client. I told you the process would move once we confirmed the fraud. I said it would move fast. I didn't expect county records to process the notice this quickly, but they did." She paused. "Zane, there's something else. Once we filed the challenge, it triggered an automatic freeze on any assets currently distributed under the contested will. That includes your father's shares in Apex Horizon. You froze his shares. The court did. Automatically. Until probate resolves who the rightful 60% owner is. A pause. Your father can't vote those shares in any board matter until this is settled. Neither can anyone he's assigned proxy to. I sat with that for a moment, because I understood immediately what it meant. Pierce Vance had been counting on my father's shares, the ones fraudulently reassigned from me to him, to control board votes on Coastal Renewal Partners' capital allocation for the Glass Mirage Resort. If those votes were frozen mid-project, Pierce had a liquidity problem that no amount of forged paperwork could fix. When does this become public record? I asked. Technically, immediately. Practically, it takes about 5 business days before anyone outside the parties involved would notice, unless someone's specifically watching the county filings. Pierce Vance's legal team was specifically watching the county filings. I would have bet Ravens Cliff on it. I drove to Oak Ridge that afternoon, not because I wanted to see my family, but because I needed to see my father's face, when he found out I already knew everything he'd spent a year hiding. The house looked exactly the same as it had 2 nights before, except this time, there were 2 cars in the driveway I didn't recognize, a black sedan with dealer plates, and a silver SUV with a rental sticker still on the windshield. I parked across the street and watched through the front window for a moment before I knocked. My mother opened the door, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, she looked afraid of me. Zane. We didn't expect. Who's here, Mom? She didn't answer, but I didn't need her to, because a voice I recognized from 11 years of quarterly board meetings called out from the living room. Zane. Come in. We should talk. Pierce Vance was sitting on my parents' couch in a charcoal suit that cost more than my father's monthly mortgage, a leather folio open on his knee, looking like a man conducting a business meeting instead of a man sitting in the home of a family he'd been slowly dismantling for a decade. Beside him sat a woman I didn't recognize, dressed in a blazer, a legal pad balanced on her lap. This is Marisol Ferrer, Pierce said. Outside counsel for Apex Horizon. I know what a lawyer looks like, Pierce. My father stood near the fireplace again, same spot as 2 nights before, arms crossed, jaw tight, except this time he wouldn't meet my eyes at all. We heard there's some confusion about your grandmother's estate, Pierce said, his voice smooth, rehearsed. We wanted to get ahead of it before this becomes a distraction from the Glass Mirage launch. The board has a lot riding on stability right now. There's no confusion, I said. There's a forged will, filed by a notary whose license was suspended 8 days before he signed it. Filed from an office on the 4th floor of your building, Pierce. The room went quiet in a specific way, not shocked quiet, but calculated quiet, the kind of silence that happens when people who already know something is true are deciding how much to admit. Marisol Ferrer spoke first, her voice even. Mr. Miller, I'd caution you against making accusations you can't substantiate. I can substantiate all of it. Suspended license, date discrepancy, notary address matching Apex Horizon's 4th floor, and an email chain showing my father asked your firm's counsel how to challenge a codicil 3 weeks before my grandmother died. I looked at my father. You knew about the codicil before she was even gone. My father's jaw worked but nothing came out. It was my mother who spoke, and her voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since I was a teenager. Evelyn told me, Helena said. 6 weeks before she died. She called me and said she was changing things, that she wanted to make sure the company stayed protected, that she started again. That she thought you'd sell everything the second you got the chance. She said you never understood what building something meant. So you decided to steal it instead. We didn't steal anything, my father said, finally finding his voice low and hard. Pierce helped us fix a mistake your grandmother made in her final months. She wasn't well, Zane. She wasn't thinking clearly. I almost laughed. She was sharp enough to hide a fireproof file cabinet with a paper trail that leads directly back to Russell Combs' suspended license. That's not confusion, Dad. That's a woman who knew exactly what you'd try to do. Pierce closed his folio, slow, deliberate, a moon recalibrating. Zane, whatever you think you found, understand this. The board has already approved capital deployment for Glass Mirage based on the current ownership structure. If you disrupt that now, over some old family dispute, you're not just hurting your father. You're hurting 300 employees, 40 subcontractors, and every investor who's already wired capital into Coastal Renewal Partners. I let that sentence hang in the room for a moment, because Pierce had just handed me something he didn't realize he'd handed me, confirmation that he had no idea who actually controlled Coastal Renewal Partners' 40% stake. You're right, I said. A lot of people have a lot riding on that capital staying in place. Something in my tone must have registered, because Pierce's eyes narrowed slightly. What does that mean? It means you should talk to your fund administrators about who Hartwell Bridge Capital actually is before you promise anyone else's money to a project that isn't as stable as you're telling them it is. I watched Pierce's face for the exact moment the name landed. It took 2 seconds. His eyes flicked toward Marisol, and hers flicked back at him with the particular blankness of a lawyer who has just realized she's missing critical information her client should have given her. Hartwell Bridge is a boutique fund out of Charleston, Pierce said, but his voice had lost its smoothness. We vetted them thoroughly before onboarding as a limited partner. Then you know the registered agent's name, I said. Whitmore Holdings, LLC. I watched him search his memory for that name and come up empty, because Whitmore was my mother's maiden name, used exactly once, on exactly one filing, 4 years ago, when I was quietly building something for myself that had nothing to do with Apex Horizon at all. That's my mother's maiden name, I said, looking at Helena, whose face had gone pale in a way I'd never seen before. You should ask her about it sometime. Or better yet, ask your fund administrators to pull the beneficial ownership disclosure on Whitmore Holdings the next time they file with the SEC. I turned and walked toward the door, and for the second time that week, nobody stopped me. But this time, as I reached for the doorknob, my father said something that stopped me cold. Zane. Before you go. His voice had changed, quieter now, stripped of the hardness from a moment ago. There's something about your grandmother's death you don't know. Something the will fight isn't going to fix. I turned around. She didn't die of a stroke, my father said. That's what we told everyone. That's what the family believes. But the actual medical examiner's report says something different, and Pierce has had a copy of it for the last 14 months. I stood in that doorway with my hand still on the knob, and for the first time since Pierce Vance slid that manila folder across a conference table, I felt something I hadn't expected. Fear. Not for myself. For the shape of what my father had just said. What does the report actually say? I asked. My father looked at Pierce and something passed between them, not permission, but a kind of resignation, like a man who'd been carrying a weight long enough that setting it down felt like relief even when the consequences were terrible. Your grandmother had an adverse reaction to a medication interaction, my father said. Warfarin and an antibiotic her physician prescribed without checking her existing chart. The medical examiner flagged it as a preventable error. Malpractice, technically. The hospital settled with the estate quietly, 11 months ago, for $1.2 million. I felt my chest go tight. Who signed off on that settlement? I did, my father said. As executor named in the second will. There it was. The final piece. You didn't just forge her estate to steal Apex Horizon shares, I said slowly, working through it out loud. You used the fraudulent executor position to settle a wrongful death claim quietly, so it would never become public, and you kept the money. Pierce cut in before my father could answer. That settlement was structured through Apex Horizon's corporate insurance, Zane. It's not as simple as you're making it sound. Where did the $1.2 million go, Pierce? Marisol Ferrer closed her legal pad. I noticed the small movement, because it told me something the lawyer wasn't saying out loud. She hadn't known about this either, and she was already calculating her firm's exposure. My father answered instead of Pierce, and his voice had gone flat, defeated. It went into Coastal Renewal Partners. as a founding capital contribution. Under my name. My grandmother's wrongful death settlement had been funneled into funding the very resort project that got me fired, laundered through a probate fraud my own father orchestrated, guaranteed by shares stolen from me through a codicil he'd hidden before she was even in the ground. I didn't say anything else. I walked out, got in my car, and drove back to Ravens Cliff in a silence that lasted the entire 3 hours. I spent the next 9 days building something instead of reacting to it. I met with Renata twice, then with a forensic accountant named Priya Deshmukh, who Renata brought in specifically to trace the settlement funds through Coastal Renewal Partners' capital accounts. Priya confirmed within 4 days that the $1.2 million had been recorded as a founder's contribution from Arthur Miller, with no disclosure to limited partners, including Hartwell Bridge Capital, including me, that the money originated from a wrongful death settlement tied to the estate currently under legal challenge. That was securities fraud, layered on top of probate fraud, layered on top of the forged termination file that had gotten me removed from the Glass Mirage project in the first place. On the 10th day, I called Marisol Ferrer directly, not Pierce. I want to give you the chance to get ahead of this, I told her. Because when this becomes public, Apex Horizons' exposure isn't limited to the board. It extends to outside counsel who continued advising a client after concealing material fraud from limited partners. There was a long pause on the line. What are you proposing? A meeting. All parties. This Thursday. I'll bring the documentation. You bring the board. She agreed faster than I expected, which told me she'd already started distancing her firm from Pierce Vance in her own mind. The meeting happened at Ravens Cliff. I chose the location deliberately because nobody in my family had ever seen it, and because as a limited partner in Coastal Renewal Partners, Hartwell Bridge Capital had the contractual right to call an emergency capital review meeting anywhere it chose. Pierce didn't know that clause existed until Marisol pointed it out to him 3 days before the meeting, at which point it was too late to object. 22 people walked through the front door of a house my grandmother had quietly protected for 30 years, the Apex Horizon Board, 4 outside investors in Coastal Renewal Partners, Marisol Ferrer and 2 associates, my father, my mother, Kira, and Damon, who'd insisted on coming despite nobody inviting him. Pierce walked in last, expecting to run the meeting the way he'd run every meeting for 11 years. He stopped in the foyer when he saw the name on the visitor sign-in sheet Renata had set up at the entrance, not Zane Miller, but Zane Whitmore, managing partner, Hartwell Bridge Capital. You're Whitmore Holdings, he said quietly, more to himself than to me. I have been for 4 years, I said. I walked the room through the documentation in order. The codicil. The suspended notary license. The forged second will. The frozen shares. The wrongful death settlement. The undisclosed capital contribution. Priya Deshmukh presented the forensic accounting to the investors directly, in numbers too specific to argue with, dates, account transfers, wire confirmations. My mother sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the floor. Kira had gone pale beside Damon, who kept glancing at the door like he was calculating how quickly he could leave once the venue's connection to the wedding fund became relevant, which it did. 7 minutes later, when Priya noted that $50,000 had been withdrawn from Coastal Renewal Partners' operating account 2 weeks earlier, listed as consulting fees, and deposited into an account under Kira Miller's name. Kira's wedding deposit had come out of the fraud. You didn't know, I said to her, and I meant it as a question, watching her face. I didn't ask where it came from, she said quietly, which wasn't an answer but it was honest. The investors didn't wait for the board to vote. 2 of them stood up before I'd even finished the presentation, and asked Marisol directly what their liability exposure looked like if they didn't withdraw their capital commitment within the week. She told them the truth, because she'd already made her decision to protect her firm over her client. Pierce Vance stood at the head of the room he no longer controlled, and said the only thing left to say. This doesn't have to end the company, Zane. There's a version of this where you take your 60%, I stay on as CEO, we rebuild the project structure clean. I thought about the manila folder. The forged change orders. The night my parents put my winter coat in a cardboard box. I thought about my grandmother's fireproof cabinet, labeled in her own handwriting, waiting for someone to open it who was finally ready. "No," I said. "You're removed as CEO effective today, per emergency board resolution under Hartwell Bridge Capital's controlling interest. Marisol will draft the transition paperwork. Whitfield and Cross will file criminal referrals on the notary fraud and securities violations with the State Attorney General's office by Monday." I turned to my father last. He looked smaller than I remembered, standing in a house he hadn't known existed 3 weeks earlier, having lost the company, the settlement money, and the version of himself that had convinced everyone, including himself, that stealing from his own son was protecting the family. "I'm not filing criminal charges against you," I said, and I watched something in his face loosen before I finished the sentence. "The state will decide that, not me. But I want you to know I found the fireproof cabinet before I read a single word in it. Grandma didn't leave me a company, Dad. She left me proof because she already knew what you'd do the moment she was gone. I didn't walk away from the family that night. I stayed because leaving would have meant someone else got to write what happened in that room after I left, and I wasn't willing to hand that over anymore." 6 months later, Apex Horizon Group operates under new leadership, with Marisol Ferrer, of all people, serving as interim compliance counsel to the board. The Glass Mirage Resort broke ground in April, redesigned from my original plans, funded transparently, with Hartwell Bridge Capital as the lead investor of record. My father is awaiting trial on charges of probate fraud and securities violations. My mother testified against him in exchange for limited immunity. Kira returned the $50,000 in installments and postponed the wedding. I don't know if she'll ever fully understand what her name was attached to, but she calls me now, sometimes, just to talk, and I answer. I still live at Ravens Cliff. Some mornings I stand on that deck and think about a woman who spent 30 years quietly protecting a piece of coastline and a paper trail, waiting for the one person in her family who'd know what to do with both. She was right to wait for me instead of trusting anyone else.